I guess the first thing to say is that having spent a good 20 odd years in Europe and having been involved in a lot of the benefits that Alistair was alluding to before in terms of prefabrication and the benefits that come from engineering or producing building bits off-site in a factory is a huge jump which New Zealand is about to go through. I've been busy in a number of different places, mainly in the Netherlands, but other places in Europe and also in Asia. This one happens to be in Auckland. But the reason that I'm raising that is not only do I bring some experience in terms of different scales of buildings from those other places, but I've also been involved in helping to set up a new organisation which is about a year and a half old called Prefab NZ. And it should help immensely all of you to be able to look at alternatives for how do you rehouse yourselves in the short term. And the first thing to say is that amazingly we've managed to pull off very short term the possibility of half a dozen housing types which will be available for you to go and have a look at the end of March. It's called Hive. You can check it out at the prefabnz.com website, but it will be at the Agricultural Park, which will be opening on the 24th and 25th of March. And that will continue to expand over the next 2 years, a whole range of other housing types. But essentially it's still dealing with a simple house on a property at the moment. And what you see here is more than that. And it's about a whole bunch of other issues which relate to compact urban environments which also mix uses of living and working and recreation in villages which are sustainable for the long term. And the other thing which is really, really exciting about this is that when you think of our natural resources like timber, for example, it's been talked about quite a lot today, is what do we do as a community, not just Christchurch, but New Zealand, in terms of added value? You think of all these logs that are going offshore, we talked about that, to China and wherever, and you compare what we get back in terms of export with countries like Austria, which earns 5 times what we do, and they have pretty much the same cubic meterage and pretty much the same kind of quality. So there's massive opportunity for us to go through a huge transformation of not just rehousing ourselves, but creating new industries, and not just for New Zealand, but in terms of export, what we can bring as a knowledge set, a skill set, right across the whole working community in terms of, I guess, examples and products that we can then ship to other places on the planet. So that then taken to the challenge of Peterborough Village in the sense of scale, and the other thing I should say, thanks very much to Mark and Rhea, and also to Di for inviting me here and looking after me. And one of the things that all of them have said to me is that scale is a big issue, both in terms of the emotional response to the earthquake, in the sense of not having heavy or big buildings that fall on top of you when other earthquakes happen. And so that emotional response, I think, is really critical. And what's intriguing for me is that out of some experiments that I was busy with in the Netherlands, we were exploring other kinds of typologies, much lighter and more flexible, that could go on top of existing buildings, post-war buildings, as their response after the war about rebuilding. You know, because the whole of Europe was struck by similar challenges of how do you rehouse yourselves, and they also went through this massive jump as a kind of skill set jump from the old ways of building things to new ways of building things. And as I'm sure probably most of your kids or grandchildren are, and perhaps many of yourselves, busy with, whether it's Meccano or current generation Lego, not the old generation in the sense of bricks, but the new Technics Lego, or Bionicles as the kids call it, Mindstorms robots. And what's really amazing about this stuff is it's very playful. It engages you. So the other thing that's interesting about this is something that you can play with, something you can explore and try things out with. So it's about engaging people in this step change in a very direct way, which even non-experts can explore and have, if you like, professionals in factories deliver the large-scale stuff. And what's interesting here is this is a cartoon from Buckminster Fuller, who was an engineer and an inventor in America in the kind of 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. And he did this beautiful drawing that kind of summarizes the difference between the way that we handle construction of buildings compared to the car industry. And he said, imagine if we built cars like the way we build buildings. Wouldn't it be berserk? I mean, the cost would be astronomical, the quality would be crap, and so on. And it would take a hell of a lot longer to realise. So this massive shift that the car industry has gone through over the last 100 or so years, from that kind of very either exceedingly expensive, beautifully crafted series of one-offs, which roughly ran through to about World War One. And obviously before that, people like Ford and Citroën in Europe explored mass production, but that was very limited in terms of the choices that you had. Like Ford famously always said, you can choose whatever car you like as long as it's a Model 10, as long as it's black. So his attitude was one suit fits all. And you guys look quite different to me. As I look across the audience, there's a massive diversity in Peterborough Village. So clearly one suit doesn't fit all. And what's interesting in the transformation in the automobile industry is something to learn from, is that gradually organisations, for example, like Toyota, started to engage much more seriously with their workers and with quality control, and also diversity in terms of a range of a much bigger range of different kinds of products to suit different kinds of client needs. And that's increasing massively now with the next transformation, which computer tools in terms of fabrication and also the quality jump that I mentioned before that can happen in factory conditions. The other thing that's interesting to mention, going back to Ford, because here's a classic Ford from the 30s, is that another one of Buckminster Fuller's inventions was this, which is a one-off prototype using exactly the same chassis, exactly the same engine, but this one houses or transports 5 people, and this one, actually, if you look on YouTube, there are even movies of this thing with, I don't know, about 16 or 18 people coming out of it. It's supposed to carry, I think, about 9 or 10, but it's effectively a minibus. Now, the reason I'm raising this is because the form that you're looking at is fundamentally different in terms of how it performs. This is way more slippery. It manages to go 4 times the distance that this thing goes and carry many more people, as I mentioned, on the same amount of fuel. So that tells you something about how our buildings should also perform. So there are lessons here in terms of not only the methods by which we make things, so again this prefabrication, but also the kind of performance that we should be demanding of the end result. And the other thing that I think is really, really interesting, which comes back to this, and this is a 1 to 10 scale model of a very simple structure that you could use straight away, that you can play with it, but using mini prototyping to enable a lot of experimentation and exploration very cheaply and inexpensively to explore many different new kinds of ideas, and then how you can put together a structure pretty much in a day and explore its possibilities as not just architecture, but also integrating things like furniture, storage, all those other things that you need a building to do. The Japanese used to traditionally integrate many of their furniture requirements into the actual building fabric, and this is kind of exploring that idea. So there's a lot of depth in the structure which enables many other things to go on. And then just quickly running through how do you then translate that through the computer tools that I mentioned earlier, using, if you like, that translation of computer drawings into computer generated and numerically controlled fabrication, and then exploring things, you know, for big kids and little kids, about how you might want to develop ideas for habitation. And out of this, if you like, technology or skill set that the ClickRaft develops, a whole range of types have started to be explored. This is a very simple one which has led to things like this, which is, imagine for a minute that we're in Christchurch. It's actually in the Netherlands, this particular shot, but it could easily be Christchurch. And literally a day after the earthquake has happened, you assemble a kit set like this, which is autonomous. It takes water off the roof if you need it. It generates solar energy from the louver skins. And essentially you've got an independent module which is 30 square metres, and instead of the current 10 square metre rule that we have in the Netherlands, in New Zealand, the 10 square metre rule which doesn't require planning permission, that's what I'm referring to, whereas in the Netherlands it's 30 square metres, so you can effectively build a double garage instantly, very quickly. And you could do it on your back lawn, which means that you can be right there, right bang next to, and be looking after and access, you know, all of your things in your existing house. It also means that over time you could decide whether or not you want to stay or reclad that structure, and choose, you know, do you shore up the existing building that you've already got, or demolish it and build something else, or even build more of these, and a range of different finishes and so on. Jumping from purely domestic, it's also possible to use the same kind of thinking for workspace or retail space, so for businesses to operate. And this is a bit of a hybrid with the veneer lumber timber columns, with this skillion, a very light skillion roof on top. And then jumping to the next type, which is exploring prefabricated schools. And this was a submission that I put to the Future Schools competition at the end of last year in Australia, because they're completely rethinking schools and the whole pedagogy of, you know, how do you teach, shifting from the old top-down methods of one teacher to 30 kids, and, you know, peer-to-peer, the opportunities for kids to learn from each other and so on. So that also raises issues about how kids learn and what kind of buildings might facilitate that. So all of those things are about how we live and how we learn, and that it's becoming more flexible, and how we can generate architecture which helps facilitate those possibilities. Then coming from the small stuff back into the bigger things, the thought that why not, especially in this first few years of responding to these challenges that we have, create a kind of base layer of, you know, 2 to 4 stories, which is what we're talking about here, and that's creating, you know, lovely courtyards which are sheltered from busy and hectic streets, that also enable many different kinds of activity, whether it's working or living or a school or whatever it might be. And then at a later stage that you could possibly come back to higher buildings if that was seen to be appropriate, and that they could plug into that. And again, all of this is assembled as a kit of parts in much the same way that Alistair was talking about before. I don't think this video is going to work, unfortunately, but it's on my blog site, which shows live how that system is assembled. It's me literally doing it live, and it's happening in minutes, not years. So that's also kind of interesting in terms of what you can do. And with this, as you can probably imagine, you know, if Gran comes to stay tomorrow, well then, you know, it's an overnight task, isn't it? You know, get out there and start building. So, and this is a shot from the school. And just to finish off, not only do we have the Expo that I mentioned in March that's happening here in Canterbury, so I think that's extremely important, but also in New Plymouth at Pukeariki Museum, there's going to also be an expo of a whole range of different prefabricated new experiments as well as some of the established ones. And I think that, you know, something really special that as many of you as possible go and have a look, because it will start to open minds about what's available. So with that, thanks very much for having me here.
Thanks, because we'd dearly love to have done get the community to assemble one of these in our village.
Any questions?
What do you put it on?
Well, that's a good question, but I guess there's two responses to that. As little as possible is the first answer. Alistair alluded to a bunch of things, which all of which are possible with this. I thought his insight of carrying your foundations up a level is a goodie. That's an absolute gem in terms of a way of thinking. But, you know, again, I guess the thing to really say that was a deep finding from today, and it was really special to have so many experts here today, you know, questioning each other in terms of the geotechnics, in terms of structural thinking, and the findings that have come out of that is that what's under the ground is incredibly complex. So making sure that we take learning more deeply, more seriously, and investing in that is really critical. But perhaps the biggest lesson is that the lighter you build, the less need for foundations there is in terms of the expense. And I think it's the expense that's probably the most critical thing for rebuilding Peterborough Village.